It's time to talk about the biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are the chemical reactions that summarize how matter is recycled through the biosphere. Remember, energy is never recycled. It's always either stored or it's used up and then or lost as heat, but it's not recycled. Since living things are mostly made up of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and water, which contains hydrogen and oxygen, we're going to focus in this unit on how carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and water get recycled. The first of the cycles is water. It's probably the easiest one to understand. The water cycle is basically fueled by evaporation and condensation. Evaporation uh, moves liquid water from the oceans up into the atmosphere, and when that moisture laden air from the oceans, well, as air travels over the oceans, it becomes loaded with moisture. As that then travels over the land, if it hits a cold front or if it starts to rise up over mountains, it'll drop that moisture in the form of rain. The major water reservoir on Earth is the oceans. And evaporation of water puts pure water essentially in the air, not salt water, pure water. Water also does evaporate from leaves of trees, and that's kind of important in the rainforest. In the Brazilian Amazon jungle, in the hot sun at midday, tremendous amounts of water is evaporating off the trees, and as that moisture-laden, warm, hot air rises, it hits cooler air above, and that causes flash thunderstorms in the tropics. Uh, so condensation brings the rain down. The water tends to run into the oceans, and in the oceans, eventually it'll evaporate back out and it'll go back into the air. So the water cycle involves the vapor phase, which is where water's in the air, and the liquid phase, where water is in basins, either lakes or the ocean or rivers or streams or creeks. So the water cycle is pretty simple. The oxygen carbon cycle, we'll talk first just briefly about the oxygen cycle. The oxygen cycle is a little more complicated. Oxygen makes up about 20% of the atmosphere that we breathe in. And we consume that oxygen. We breathe it in and we use the oxygen up in respiration. Fires use up oxygen, and burning gasoline uses up oxygen. And oxygen also gets up as things like iron rust. In other words, as things oxidize, oxygen gets used up. But the oxygen is replaced back to the atmosphere by photosynthesis. So while lots of things are taking oxygen out of the air, photosynthesis is generally putting it back into the air. The oxygen from photosynthesis comes from actually plants breaking down water. And then the oxygen that disappears from the atmosphere uh, it could be turned into water because of respiration, or it could be turned into like an oxide because the oxygen reacted with iron to form a rust. The carbon cycle is probably a little more important for our discussion. The carbon cycle involves the removal of carbon from the air. The carbon that's in the air is in the form of carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis removes that carbon from the air, and it produces sugar and puts oxygen into the air. So at any rate, photosynthesis generally removes carbon from the air, and respiration puts the carbon back into the air. Uh, Essentially, the overall equations for photosynthesis and respiration are opposites. And the carbon that's being recycled back and forth moves from a gaseous phase to a solid phase and then back to a gaseous phase. Carbon dioxide is a gaseous phase of carbon, and sugar is a solid phase of carbon. A lot of carbon on Earth is trapped in limestone. When coral animals in the ocean build their skeletons, they use basically baking soda, which is sodium hydrogen carbonate, and that traps the carbon and prevents it from going back into the air. So Earth at one time had a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, and now there's very little actually in the air. Um, so the oceans also represent a huge sink for carbon dioxide. The oceans will absorb carbon dioxide and they react it with water to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then goes on to form, and this is carbonic acid. The carbonic acid goes on to form basically baking soda or hydrogen carbonate and hydrogen ions floating in the ocean. But the bottom line is the carbon dioxide that goes in the air doesn't just stay there. Some of it gets soaked out of the air by the ocean, and some carbon never gets put back in the air after it's taken out because it's part of the skeleton of a coral. So the carbon cycle, generally speaking, it's the removal of carbon dioxide from the air by photosynthesis or coral, and then the respiration of carbon dioxide back to the air as sugars are broken down. The nitrogen cycle is probably the most complicated of all the cycles. The Earth's reservoir of nitrogen is actually in the air. Air is 78% nitrogen. And nitrogen gas is fixed or removed from the air by bacteria living in the roots of legumes. The bacteria living in the roots do a process called nitrogen fixation, where they convert the nitrogen gas to ammonia. At that point, the ammonia is converted to nitrites by bacteria. Other bacteria convert the nitrites to nitrates, and then the nitrates are absorbed by plant roots, and the plants use those to build their proteins. And then when a plant dies, its proteins are broken down by decomposers, and its nitrogen is often denitrified back to the air. So nitrogen is actually kind of a complicated story, but the bottom line is without nitrogen availability in soil and on lawns, plants cannot grow. So nitrogen fixation, nitrification, and are extremely important processes for the health of most terrestrial and aquatic systems because those processes make nitrogen available to life forms that otherwise couldn't get it. So the bottom line is you breathe in nitrogen all the time in the form of nitrogen gas, but you can't use that because it's in a form that your body can't do anything with. You can use nitrogen in the form of amino acids. Your nitrogen comes to you through your foods in the form of amino acids. So in general, the pathway of nitrogen goes from gas to ammonia in the soil in roots, to nitrites and nitrates in roots, to amino acids and proteins in plants, to amino acids and proteins in animals, and then back to nitrogen gas once the animals and plants die by denitrification. And that's what this diagram is representing. We have nitrogen fixation here going on, producing ammonia. The ammonia is converted to nitrites and then on to nitrates by nitrifying bacteria. Assimilation actually converts the nitrates to amino acids as plants pull the nitrates in through their roots, and then the plants pass the amino acids on to other animals or to fungi when they die. Other animals will use the nitrates, but ultimately when the animals and the plants die, decomposers will return the nitrogen back to the soil as ammonia, and some of that, you'll notice, some of that may end up going back after nitrates. Some nitrates get just denitrified back to nitrogen gas in the air. So these overall processes kind of balance out. The amount of nitrogen being put in the air is about the same as the amount being taken out of the air. Next, we have the phosphorus cycle, which is also, thankfully, a rather easy one. Phosphorus is mainly found in rock, like limestone. It leaches out of rocks whenever rainwater runs over the rocks, and it goes into the neighboring water supply, and that's where the algae pick it up, and then the food chain starts, and living things pass the phosphates from one to another. So the phosphorus cycle includes basically only solids. There's no gaseous phosphate or phosphorus at all. It's passed between living things through food and water. And we have to have phosphorus because it's part of our ATP phosphate energy transduction system, so we have to have it. Now, unlike terrestrial systems where excessive nutrients cause excessive luxurious growth, but not necessarily death to any life forms in the ecosystem, in aquatic systems, if there's excess nutrients, you can often get a collapse and all the animal life in the system dies. So this is a golf course lake. You can notice the entire lake is green. And that's because there's too many nitrate nutrients in the water because of over fertilization of the surrounding uh, grassy areas, and as a result, the water in the lake is overgrown with algae. Algae will grow wherever there's lots of nutrients, and the algae will use up all the oxygen and kill the fish. This is called an algal bloom. So excess nutrients on a lawn cause the grass to grow really solidly, but see, the nutrients from here run into a lake, and that's where the real problem sets in, is where the lake collapses due to algal bloom. So, unlike terrestrial systems where excess nutrients can be kind of healthy for trees and grasses, in an aquatic system, it's a disaster. So, the only thing that keeps water clear is nutrient limitation. The reason mountain water is crystal clear is nutrient limitation. So, nutrient limitation is a phenomenon that's important to the health of all lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams and oceans. If you add too much nitrogen and phosphorus to any water supply, you get an overgrowth of algae, and in turn, all the animals die. This happens in the ocean as red tide. We have coral bleaching going on around the world, and it's happening in freshwater lakes like you see here, where all the fish die. Now, a couple of last things before we go to the biomes. Habitat and niche are two important terms in ecology. A niche is something an organism does. It's like where it's feeding in a food chain, where it lives, what does it do? Whereas its habitat is specifically the place where it lives. Niche is dependent on habitat, and habitat in a way determines niche. So these terms, niche and habitat, will come up again in ecology. Probably should have already introduced them. And then a few last interactions. There's different ways that organisms interact in a community. They can be predator-prey, they can be competing, and then they can be symbiotic. So in general, predation has a few rules. First off, if two complete competitors coexist, one will become extinct. What complete competitors are two life forms that eat exactly the same foods. If that happens, one of them will be intrinsically better than the other, and one will wipe the other out. When goats were introduced to the island of Mauritius, in a matter of less than, I think it was 30 or 40 years, all of the dodo birds on the island died. And that was because goats and dodo birds were both feeding on the plants on the islands, and the goats were better competitors than the dodo birds, so the dodo birds went extinct. So two organisms cannot occupy the same food chain spot. One of them will wipe the other one out. And that is the problem with invasive species. Anytime you bring over a foreign species and start growing it in your yard, or you let your pet whatever go at the neighboring park, you can start an invasive species disaster where it ends up outcompeting uh, other native organisms for food, and it wipes them out. The only thing is, it doesn't take the same place, important spot in the food chain. Other animals may not want to feed on it, and as a result, a whole food base disappears. So if you let the crayfish go that you were fishing with, and those crayfish wipe out the native crayfish, it may be that the native crayfish were food for the frogs, but the new crayfish are not, and as a result, the frogs end up going extinct too, as a result of these invasive species crayfish. So here in Missouri, we have a real problem with bush honeysuckle, which is a very intense competitor for light on a Missouri forest floor. So invasive species are a real problem when it comes to predator-prey and consumer interaction. Now, organisms that live together often have to compete. They compete for den space, roaming space, and water and other resources. And generally speaking, one's going to be a winner and the other one's going to be a loser. So competition, like for example, these meerkats are competing with one another for space. And this is a predator-prey interaction. The hawk is eating a snake as a prey, and here the praying mantis is eating a small prey animal also. These are all different kinds of interactions. These are interactions between members of the same species, members of different species, members of different species. And that brings us to a very unique kind of interaction between species, symbiosis. Symbiosis is an intimate living relationship between different species. There are three different ways this happens. commensalism, parasitism, mutualism. Commensalism is where one species is helped, but the other species is not harmed or helped. And so they're just kind of going along for the ride. You've got a number of bacteria growing on your skin that are just there and they really don't do much for you. Some do, but some don't. The ones that don't do anything for you are commensals. The ones that are doing things for you are different. They're mutualists. Lichens growing on the bark of a tree are commensals. They don't help the tree, but for the most part, they're not hurting the tree either. You have little mites right now crawling around on your eyebrows. Don't freak out. They're all over your bed. And they're commensals. They don't bother you. You really don't bother them. They're definitely helped, but you're not harmed or helped. Now, parasitism, on the other hand, if you get cooties, which are lice, they actually kind of hurt you. Mites hurt you. Viruses hurt you. In parasitism, one species is helped and the other one is harmed. Leeches attaching to your foot or pneumonia bacteria in your lungs are definitely parasitic associations. So these kind of interactions are different than predator-prey. You're sort of living together. It's not like the one species eats the other. You're living together, but it's in a harmful way. Mutualism is where both species live intimately together and they help each other. Some of the bacteria in your colon make vitamins for you. So you're helping them by giving them food and a place to live, and they're helping you by giving you vitamins. So that's a mutualistic relationship. This is one of the best known mutualistic relationships of the oceans. This is a clownfish and the anemone that it lives on. The clownfish helps to keep the anemone alive and feeds it, and the anemone with the stingers keeps the clownfish safe, and it won't sting the clownfish. Now, this is right here a type of parasitism. You'll notice all these eggs, except for one, match. This is a cowbird egg. Cowbirds don't make nests. They actually, a female cowbird will find a nest. Then as soon as the female leaves the nest, she will swoop down, lay her egg on the nest and fly away. When the other bird comes back and sits on the eggs, the cowbird egg usually is the first to hatch, and it often knocks all the other eggs out of the nest. That's called brood parasitism. And it's rare, but the cowbird does that, and the European cuckoo bird does that. And these are barnacles living on the side of what appears to be probably a whale. And they're really not doing much in the way of hurting the whale. They do slow it down a little bit, but they're more commensalistic than they are parasitic. So these are interactions between species that are living arrangements. They're not predator-prey where one animal's just flat out dying. That brings us to the last topic in this section, which is succession. It turns out that most areas on the planet are changing, and that's because at some time previous there was a catastrophe, a tornado, a drought, a flood, a fire, something happened, and slowly but surely an ecosystem changes from its original colonizing species to a more stable climax species or population community type. So the first species that occupy a disturbed area usually are the ones that can disperse easily and have really rapid reproduction rates. Things like dandelions are notorious for this. They're called pioneer species. So after a catastrophe like a flood or a fire or something, or a volcanic eruption where everything dies, the first species to move in are not the species often that were there. Species from neighboring areas blow in. Those are the pioneers. They tend to help build up soil and build up food chains. And then slowly the pioneer species are replaced by organisms that live longer and are more stable. Those are called climax species. And the climax community is the final community that will result after the community slowly changes from pioneer to climax state. No climax state lasts forever. Eventually, every square inch of North America will be hit by a tornado or a fire or a flood, and then it will rebound, and that's what succession is all about. This is a volcanic area where all the plants were killed, and new pioneer species are growing in. Eventually, it'll be the original scrub forest that it once was. This is an abandoned field that will become a deciduous forest, but it's going to take time for all of the trees to grow in. Right now, we have pioneer species in here, grasses and weeds, but we have a few trees growing in, and more trees will fill in. Pioneer tree species will be first, like elm and maples, but those will be replaced by oaks and hickories because they're the climax species for the long run.